So thanks for joining us again. I think we're going to maybe have 4 to 6 more sessions, depending on how much time I have to get through everything. And welcome to those of you too who are watching this recorded. There's been a lot of interest in it on our YouTube channel, and we're going to continue to post these there. We're going to move back to medieval times. And as I made the joke last time in class, this isn't the fun one with the jousting and the I guess the big Renaissance, chicken bones. This is where people really lived, for better or worse, somewhat difficult lives, and the Jews are part of that too. I want to just review with you very, very quickly a tiny bit of contextual history. This isn't really a Jewish history class, but it is because, we've encountered this in so many places. But I just want to recount for you a little bit of where we are. So, and I think I actually ended with this last week, but that's all right. I can repeat it. We sort of got through the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, which is where our focus was. And we're getting into an era now. It's a very long era that it sort of goes under the unfortunately collective name of the Middle Ages or medieval history, what have you, even though there's lots of different eras and there's lots of different times, and there was all kinds of progress that was made during these times. So that's just what any historian would tell us. But by and large, it was in most places characterized at some times, and then later it became more centralized by feudalism, by a lot of political power in the church, which controlled the economies of many places, education, social organization, and so forth, as more and more power began to aggregate in the hands of monarchs. Again, depending on where you lived, it was much, much less concentrated in Germany, where there were just countless numbers of political entities, and much more concentrated in areas like France and certainly after the 12th century in Britain and what became the United Kingdom. There were certain ideas about Jews who were few and far between. And really, I'm showing you on this map here, this is the concentration of where Jews were. We are accustomed to thinking about Jews like way over here to the right, but they really weren't there yet in any major numbers. And it was the events of the 13th century that we're going to be examining today, and maybe a little bit next week as we move forward in time, that led to Jewish communities being established there. In the meantime, Jews were mostly scattered in tiny communities around here. They never really grew to any great numbers. The tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands in some places. Thankfully, there was a thriving Jewish community in the south, in the Iberian Peninsula, that was growing, which is not part of this particular story. We're going to get to that when we talk about Spain. It really was its own area. North Africa and the Middle East and so forth, there were lots of Jews there. And in fact, there's a whole other story to be told about Jewish flourishing up through the 10th, 11th century in Babylon and its connection with Spain and so forth. There's also the issue of the Arab conquest, but that was not primarily an anti-Semitic incident. It was something that affected the whole area. And in fact, the spread of Islam had some very good effects on Jews in those places, but that's not the story for a history of anti-Semitism. So as usual, when we talk about certain areas in Germany, it may not have affected the largest numbers of Jews, but it would go on to affect their future. Sometimes we talk about this with regard to Reform Judaism. It was a tiny little movement in Germany, but it became super big because they moved to America. So we teach what happened in Germany with 12 people because it affected 4 or 5 million later on. All right, so today we're going to look at both some of the folk anti-Semitism that could be quite damaging and dangerous and was really the most deadly, and we're going to look at some of the official anti-Semitism and even the official protection, which is kind of tells us a little bit about the anti-Semitism that was going on. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this happened to the Jews for the religious reasons we've talked about. A lot of it happened because there were simply no other significant minorities in these areas of Europe. And there's always going to be somebody who's othered. And in this case, it was the Jews. So I received an email this week asking me to break down, insofar as it's possible, what was official, sort of official anti-Semitism and what was more folk or, popular anti-Semitism. I don't think it's that easy to do, but there are some ways to think about it, at least in those categories. If I were to give the best example of the sort of folk-inspired anti-Semitism, which could be, as I said, quite deadly, it would be the fervor that was created by the Crusades. The Crusades, particularly the first three Crusades, were especially deadly for Jews. The first one, in case you forgot your Crusader history, the first one began when a pope named Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. And of course, this had nothing to do with the Jews. The Jews were not in charge of Jerusalem. The Muslims were in charge of Jerusalem. So this had a lot to do with the large world, almost series of ongoing worldwide conflicts, at least Western and North African and Middle Eastern conflicts that were taking place between Islam and Christianity, which, if you know that history, they made quite some major incursions into Europe at different times in history. But this was a moment for the Christians to rise up and free the Holy Land. Well, on their way to freeing the Holy Land, this hodgepodge of zealous crusaders who were largely led by both representatives of the nobility, of the aristocracy, even crowned heads of Europe. I think the third crusade is probably the best example of that. They were the leaders, but they were not the ones making the primary trouble. It was the large group of people who went out adventuring, and probably because they were seeking wealth and other reasons. Many of them were pious, indeed. Some of the tracks of their piety are still visible. If you go to Israel to this day, you can find different, throughout the era of these crusades, you can find different remnants of what they left behind in churches and other kinds of, even some organizations. But many were also runaway serfs. They were ambitious kinds of businessmen looking to make a buck. And as I said, adventurers and also criminals. And as they passed, particularly through Germany, which along the German, French, that whole valley there, there were significant numbers of Jews, at least for those times. This, for instance, is where Rashi lived in the 11th century, the great Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, whose commentaries are indispensable to Jews today. I don't think we would even understand how to read the Talmud had he not created a commentary explaining this sort of almost disappearing logic system that his grandchildren then kept up. His commentary on the Torah is among the most important. We teach it to children beginning in second, third grade. I still teach it on Saturday mornings. I mention that because I want you to understand what kinds of communities they were passing through. One of these was Cologne, and that's why there's a little star there. As they passed through, they viewed these, especially the hoi polloi, viewed this as an opportunity to attack the Jews, both for their wealth. And this was at a time when Jews were not simply in every place money lenders. Rashi, for instance, was a vintner; he had land. But they also saw it as an excuse to kill the infidels, and they did. They did in places like Speyer and Worms, in Mainz and Cologne. And we're going to look at a couple of firsthand documents about this, and they're not pleasant to read. The first one was written by this Albert of Ai, I think it's pronounced, who was a canon of the church in Aachen, and a historian of the First Crusade. He put together all kinds of oral and written testaments of the participants in it and produced a chronicle of it called The History of the Expedition to Jerusalem. And I should mention, if you didn't already know, we're talking about the 1090s when the First Crusade took place. So here is how he reported it, particularly in the Lorraine area. They rose in a spirit of cruelty against the Jewish people scattered through these cities and slaughtered them without mercy, especially in the kingdom of Lorraine, asserting it to be the beginning of their expedition and their duty against the enemies of the Christian faith. This slaughter of Jews was done first by citizens of Cologne. And then just to remind you where that is, there's the map up there. These suddenly fell upon a small band of Jews and severely wounded and killed many. They destroyed the houses and synagogues of the Jews and divided among themselves a very large amount of money. When the Jews saw this cruelty, about 200, in the silence of the night, began flight by boat to Neuss. The pilgrims and crusaders discovered them, and after taking away all their possessions, inflicted upon them similar slaughter, leaving not one alive. So word begins to spread about about these kinds of slaughters. And what he's talking about here is a particular band of crusaders led by a German noble who forced their way into, I'm sorry, this is what the next one we're going to read. What we're going to read next is about a particular band of German nobles who forced their way into the city of Mainz. It's not very far from Cologne. And finally into a place, a Catholic Episcopalian I'm going to pronounce this wrong, archiepiscopal palace, a large cathedral-like place where the Jews were hiding. And we're going to learn about how the church would protect Jews from time to time. That's a good thing for us to be aware of as well. The slaughter of the Jews was chronicled. However, we don't have a contemporaneous chronicle. What we do have is one that seems to have been passed down from generation to generation. So I don't want to say take it lightly. We have enough that, and the example of Albert is a good example, but this one was part of probably the largest collection. And it was written in Hebrew by a man named Solomon Bar Samson, about whom we know nothing. It was probably about 45 years later. So we can certainly assume there's some inaccuracies, but because again of the others, there's one called, and I couldn't find any decent translations or actually edited enough translations to share these with you. Eliezer Bar Nathan Chronicle. There's one called Mainz Anonymous. We know that throughout the area of the Rhineland, this kind of thing was happening. And so this is a very good example. So this Emico guy, the leader in this case, was a noble. It happened on the 3rd of Sivan at noon. So this is, it is not Tuesday, May 7th, 73rd. It is Tuesday, May 7th, that Emico the Wicked, the enemy of the Jews, came with his whole army against the city gate, and the citizens opened it up for him. Emico, a German noble, led a band of plundering German and French crusaders. Then the enemies of the Lord said to each other, the enemies of the Lord are the Jews. Then the enemies of the Lord said to each other, I'm sorry, the enemies of the Lord here are the Christians, said, look, they have opened the gate for us. Now let us avenge the blood of the hanged one. Jews frequently called Jesus the Talui, the one who was hanged. This was their way of sort of degrading him. But, you know, this was a tit for tat thing. The foe Emico proclaimed in the hearing of the community that the enemy be driven from the city and put to flight. Panic was great in the town. Each Jew in the inner court of the bishop girded on his weapons, and all moved toward the palace gate to fight the crusaders and the citizens. They fought each other up to the very gate, but the sins of the Jews, this is common language. Whenever the Jews talk about themselves and being victims, they always blame themselves. And this is something that's important to understand. This language becomes internalized for Jews. And so they will say, rather than the Jews, they'll say the sins of the Jews, the things that we did that made this happen. It was always their own fault. Even though, of course, they were afraid of the enemy, they always believed it had something to do with them. This is, you know, internalizing the victimization. And so they would refer to it, they would refer to these things themselves by their sins, causing the original exile. So the sins of the Jews brought it about that the enemy overcame them and took the gate. This was their way of not blaming God and of dealing with the problem of evil. And when I first encountered this language, because I first read this in Hebrew, I have to tell you, it was shocking to me the amount of self-blame that Jews put on themselves for this. And it reminds me nothing more of things that happened throughout Jewish anti-Semitic times, including right up to today. But I'm not going to make a sermon out of that. The hand of the Lord was heavy against his people, meaning us, the Jews. All the Gentiles were gathered together against the Jews in the courtyard to blot out their name, and the strength of our people weakened when they saw the wicked Edomites. They're comparing them to a biblical group that tried to kill the Jews, overpowering them. As soon as the enemy came into the courtyard, they found some of the very pious there with our brilliant master Isaac ben Moses. He stretched out his neck, and his head they cut off first. You'll hear a lot of this kind of thing. This is the idea that by willingly offering themselves and not fighting back, which became a problem for the Jews, but they saw this in religious terms, that they were offering themselves al kiddush Hashem. And this became a meaning for the sanctity of God's name in martyrdom. That's the Jewish word for martyrdom. That's the phrase that we use to describe martyrs. And they die for the sanctity of God's name. And this is all a way of inverting their suffering when they're being offered up in this way by people who've just coming to kill them. This is not territorial at all. It's not even religious, really, even though they base themselves, the attackers, on religious excuses. This is really simply about wanting to enrich themselves and harm the Jews. The others, wrapped by their fringed prayer shawls, their talesim, sat by themselves in the courtyard, eager to do the will of their creator. They did not care to flee into the chamber to save themselves for this temporal life, but out of love they received upon themselves the sentence of God. This is actually read in some Tisha B'Av, some 9th of Av services, some of these woes, they call them kinos. Thus were the precious children of Zion, the Jews of my aunts, tried with 10 trials, like Abraham our father, and this refers to some midrash, and like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are part of the story of the book of Daniel. They tied their sons as Abraham tied Isaac, his son. So notice how, now what happened with Abraham when he attempted to sacrifice his child? He didn't. But the Jews here saw his willingness to do so as being inspiring, and not wanting their children to be raped or killed or otherwise tortured. They actually killed their own children. And we have other documentation of this. So they tied their sons as Abraham tied Isaac, his son, and they received upon themselves with a willing soul the yoke of the fear of God, the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, rather than deny and exchange the religion of our King. Because it really became a matter of convert or die. Whether they would have been saved by conversion is in question. And we're going to look at another tragedy that happened in England where some of them did try to convert, and their conversion was not accepted from the murderers. They stretched out their necks to the slaughter, and they delivered their pure souls to their Father in heaven. Righteous and pious women bared their throats to each other, offering to be sacrificed for the unity of the name. Now, you may know the story of Masada. Josephus tells a similar story. And the story is that, you kill yourself before you allow yourself to be degraded and defiled by the others, or before you allow yourself to convert. A father turning to his son or brother, a brother to his sister, a woman to her son or daughter, neighbor to a neighbor or a friend, a groom to a bride, a fiance to fiance, would kill and would be killed, and blood touched blood. The blood of the men mingled with their wives, the blood of the fathers with their children's, the blood of the brothers with the sisters, the blood of the teachers with their disciples, the blood of the grooms with their brides, the blood of the leaders with their cantors, the blood of the judges with their scribes, and the blood of infants and suckling with their mothers. For the unity of God, they call this Ichud Hashem, the unity of God, honored and awe-inspiring name, they killed and slaughtered. Now, do we know that they committed suicide this way? We don't. And many historians believe that the stories of the mass suicide were meant to honor the dead. Suicide is really not, it's really frowned upon in Judaism. But there are a couple of places where you're allowed to do it. If you're ordered to convert to another religion, in other words, to deny God, that's how they saw it, it would be allowed. So this wouldn't have been out of the question, but we don't know if it happened. We do know they were killed. There are enough reports of that. But another reason to share this with you is because they, in memory, I think, try to elevate them. No historian can tell you whether this mass suicide took place or not. The idealization of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is very well known. But the other part of that was that God would never ask it again, right? That was, and by the way, those of you who know biblical criticism know that the original story probably did have a sacrifice, but they didn't read it that way. And none of us have read it that way since whoever edited the book of Genesis did that. We've always seen it as the moment when God made it clear to Abraham that there would not be this. But the horror against the Jews was so deep, that they were feeling was so deep, the fear was so deep, that there are other chronicles, and I didn't share these with you, that actually talk about them killing their children before the Germans and the French even arrived. But this mass slaughter absolutely occurred, and it occurred all throughout the late 11th century and into the second and third and on of these Crusades. But this was, as I recall, the worst of them. But it wasn't only the Crusades that made them this way. We're going to move on now to England. A lot of you know I really like England. I'm kind of an Anglophile. Go ahead. Ask a question, Lenore.
Did Rashi get killed during this time?
Rashi was not killed during these. I don't think they came upon where he was. And I actually don't know what his experience was. I know that he knew about this. But this was not. In fact, he had daughters about whom there's several novels that are fun to read, but not necessarily historical. And he had very famous grandsons who kept his teaching going and then created their own commentary to the Talmud that is so great that it appears right opposite of his in the Vilna edition, which is the famous layout of the Talmud, for those of you who took a little Talmud with me. And the grandsons were ruthless with their grandfather's interpretations. They said he got so much wrong, and there's a little argumentation that takes place, respectful argumentation, that family did live on. So let's move on to England. This is a good example. We don't really tend to think of England as the hotbed of anti-Semitism back then, but it was, just as it is in many ways now. And we're gonna learn, and we're not gonna read this story quite yet, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the history. How did the Jews get there? And in a sense, the history of the Jews in England turned out to be a good one, only because they got expelled the earliest. And that's what we're on our way to learning about, through these blood libels into expulsions, because that's the main point of all this. But the hatred for them was pretty big from the moment they got there. So why did they get there? Well, Jews, we think, had been there with the Romans back in the Londinium days, but that was a long, long time ago. And when the Romans left, it's likely that any Jews that were with them left too. And England and Scotland, of course, went on their merry way with their own history, with their various kingdoms that battled against each other and all of this. You may know that the current dynasty traces its origins back to the conquest, the Norman conquest in 1066. And it was with that conquest that apparently a number of Jews came from Rouen in France with the Normans, into England. And the reason being is because the early Norman kings, again, you may know this, they just built castles and palaces and fortresses everywhere throughout England. They took over that place lock, stock, and barrel. It's why we got so many French words in the English language. The English language is a Germanic language, right? But it's just filled with Latin origin words coming from French. So who was going to lend them the money to build these places? Well, of course, it was going to be the Jews. And even though these were bad times for a lot of the Angles, the Anglos, the Anglo-Saxons, who were the previous inhabitants there before the Normans came, and ultimately they all assimilated into each other. But it was a terrible time for the Jews. For a little while, it was not so bad, and also they were not such a large community. They were they were completely protected by the crown, and they established some smallish but important communities in a lot of the principal cities inside of England. One of the largest, though, was in York. And that's where we're going to go right now. From 1066 into I would say for another 100 years or so, a lot of resentment grew up against the Jews there. A lot of it had to do with the very reason that they had arrived there in the first place. But over 100, 150 years, people forget, hey, we helped bring them over so we would have this financial basis upon which to build all of our palace, all of our fortresses and our castles and so forth. But then they forget. And over time, they become deeply indebted to the small Jewish community, many of these nobles. Many of them acquired great wealth, and it was not a problem. They paid it back, they were done. Others didn't do as well. They brought over a lot from Normandy, just a lot. But of course, it also expanded into religious and theological dimensions, with disagreements between Jewish scholars and Christian churchmen. And it gave birth to a kind of anti-Semitism, a kind of a brand of anti-Semitism that would spread throughout Europe. And we call it the blood libel. These were the kinds of slanders that we had heard previously from those Greeks. Remember, they talked about the things that Jews would do, the satanic Jews. But those Greeks were, and Hellenists, pre-Christian era, that brand of anti-Semitism seemed to have died down. But here it rises up, and quite greatly. The spread of Christianity in Western Europe saw the growth of this, particularly in the aftermath of that first crusade. Because while the Jews were not major victims of the crusade in England, because most of the crusaders didn't come from England. Certainly they did, but they did have them. But it was the furthest west you could be from Jerusalem, so they didn't suffer the most, probably because of geography. But nevertheless, as the Crusades continued, the same kind of attitude towards the Jews continued to build, and this hatred and this resentment from the nobles. So it was a class to class, up one side, down the other, resentment of the Jews. Now, we don't know all the histories of all the libels. We see some things mentioned here and there, but we do have a chronicle of what is probably to this day the most famous blood libel, maybe even one you've heard of because it's that famous to this day. It goes back further than its writing, but only a few decades earlier than its writing. It is called, it was written by Thomas of Monmouth. He's the writer, and it was called The Life and Miracles of St. William of Norwich. So my history professor, Jacob Rader Marcus, a brilliant guy of blessed memory, who founded the American Jewish Archives, by the way, sitting there in Cincinnati. Who knows what's going to happen to it? They're going to have to move it. I think they're selling that property. What a loss to Jewish history. Okay, aside finished. He talks about this being really having taken place or burst forth on the scene in 1144, really being the beginning of what became just a tsunami of these kinds of accusations. The significance of these accusations, he wrote, is that by these descriptions of the Jew, they served to create increasing anti-Jewish mentality. Jews were viewed more and more as bloodthirsty. I again refer you to my talk of 3-4 weeks ago on a Friday night. And the fact that Jews in the guise of Zionists, and sometimes not in the guise of Zionism anymore, folks, if you're on social media, they just attack Jews. They tell American Jews, you're committing a genocide. So apparently you and I, or whoever, doesn't follow the party line, are committing this genocide. And this all arises from this mentality that for generations has spread about us, that essentially no Gentile child is safe near a Jew or in Jewish hands. Marcus, in his absolutely prolific writing, documents and brings to bear hundreds and hundreds of testimonials about Jews in these times having been imprisoned or killed or burnt alive on this charge. Now, the papacy frequently, and we're going to see what the papacy did, denounced it. But there were also times when they got in on the act too. And we'll also see how that happened and what happened when, despite what the papacy said, the local churches did nothing. Now, this particular case, this kid named William of Norwich, who is now a saint according to this, probably is based on the disappearance of a real child. There's a lot of evidence indicating that he actually existed. His body was found, according to many sources, and his body testified to the fact that he had died a violent death. Everything else they say here, they made up. Thomas of Monmouth, the author of it, was a monk in the Norwich Benedictine monastery. And here is the story he told, and this is the beginning of really what became a huge problem for the Jews. When, therefore, he was flourishing in this blessed boyhood of his, he's telling the story of William, and had attained to his 8th year, that would have been 1140, he was entrusted to the skinners, the furriers, to be taught their craft. So he's told the story of the childhood of this kid. And now at the age of 8, you go and learn a trade, right? This is medieval times. Now, while he was staying in Norwich, the Jews who were settled there and required their cloaks or their robes or other garments, whether pledged to them, because the Jews were that greedy, of course, that they would take people's clothes and pledge, which, according to the Bible, the Torah says you're not allowed to do that and keep it overnight. So that was a little bit of you might not have noticed the dig, but that was a dig. Or their own property, to be repaired. We preferred him before all other skinners, for they esteemed him to be especially fit for their work, either because they had learned that he was guileless and skillful, or because they were attracted to him by their avarice. They thought they could bargain with him. I mean, it's an 8-year-old, right? For a lower price. Or, as I rather believe, because by the ordering of divine providence, God sent him. He had been predestined to martyrdom from the beginning of time, and gradually, step by step, was drawn on, and chosen to be made a mock of, and to be put to death by the Jews in scorn of the Lord's passion. In other words, in defiance of what Jesus did, because the Jews hated Jesus so much, as one of little foresight, and so the more fit for them. In other words, he was an easy mark. That's what they're saying. And that he's going to be put to death to mock the crucifixion. They want to recreate it. That's how Jews get their jollies. They recreate the crucifixion. So he goes on to write, I have learned from certain Jews who were afterwards converted to the Christian faith, and boy, could these people be a problem for us. I'm debating whether I want to show a little disputation stuff that happened in Spain. I might do a tiny bit on that, only because I have a cool joke to go with it. But this tiny, it was always small, but these tiny groups of Jews who did convert, whether here or more significantly influentially in France, in Spain, they could do great damage to the Jews. Some of them were learned Jews too, and they would pick out little passages in the Talmud here or there where the rabbis were expressing anger or disapproval of other people. Usually they would just call them the heretics, and they were interpreted to be Christians, but these folks were trouble. Anyway, he learned from them, who were afterwards converted to the Christian faith, how that at that time they had planned to do this very thing with some Christian, And in order to carry out their malignant purpose at the beginning of Lent, which is the holiest season of the year for Christians, right? We're in it now. They had made choice of the boy William, being 12 years of age and a boy of unusual innocence. Oh, I forgot he was 12 here. Sorry. Passover was coming on in 3 days. And here you get that connection to the Passover sacrifice. And remember that Jesus, for some Christians, is seen as the sacrifice to end all sacrifices and is described as the Paschal sacrifice, the Pesach sacrifice. And so these connections of the blood of Jesus, the cries to Matthew, in the book of Matthew to Pilate, let his blood be upon us. These are all built into some of the only stories that they hear en masse. You know, they weren't going to movies and stuff. Yes, there were folk tales and other kinds of things, but they all gathered. And by the way, they had to attend church every week, whether they wanted to or not. And they heard these stories from their priests. So they were being mass propagandized about the perfidy of the Jews, the murderous nature of the Jews with regard to Jesus. That's why I wanted us to read those New Testament texts. They were that influential. Imagine hearing that year after year. And it was particularly repeated at this season. I think I told you the joke, you know, what's the traditional Jewish observance of Easter? To sit in your basement and cower. Because these were times, Good Friday, Easter, and so forth, when Jews were absolutely terrorized by the possibilities of what might happen to them. When these things broke out, not all the time. The Jews were doing okay for a little while in England. It wasn't a problem. It only becomes a problem when it becomes a problem. Anyway, ignorant, he was treated kindly by the Jews at first, and ignorant of what was being prepared for him, he was kept till the morrow. But on the next day, Tuesday, March 21st, which in that year was Passover, after the singing of the hymns appointed for the day in the synagogue, the chiefs of the Jews suddenly seized hold of the boy William as he was having his dinner, and in no fear of any treachery, and ill-treated him in various horrible ways. I wrote terrible descriptions follow, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of the ways that they tortured and mistreated this boy. But not even yet could the cruelty of the torturers be satisfied without adding even more severe pains. Having shaved his head, they stabbed it with countless thorn points. What is this reminiscent of? The crown of thorns placed upon Jesus' head to make the blood run down it, as it is depicted as having occurred in the New Testament, and made the blood come horribly from the wounds they made. Wherefore the chief men and the rabbis of the Jews assembled together at Narbonne, and they cast lots for all the countries which the Jews inhabit. Whatever country that lot falls upon, its metropolis has to carry out the same method with the other towns and cities, and the place whose lot is drawn has to fulfill the duty imposed upon it. So every year the Jews cast lots. This year it was Norwich's turn, and that's why this happened to poor now St. William. So there you have a great account as told by this Thomas of Monmouth, a very famous British figure, by the way, very well known. Any educated Briton will know who Thomas of Monmouth is because of these chronicles. And I think everything you could possibly say about both the Pesach blood libel and blood libel in general is encompassed in this short excerpt that I gave to you. Outbreaks of violence, as we spoke about in the Crusades and on the continent, were also well known in England. And from England, we received another report. I debated whether or not to do this one, but I think it's important because it actually does resemble things that happened elsewhere. And it's a continuation too of the uniqueness of England, but also not the uniqueness, because there are so many parallels to what happened in the other places. And these happen, I could find these in English pretty easily, even though some of them were written in Latin. So while we remain in England, just for a moment, I want to visit the events of what's called Clifford's Tower. Anybody ever been to York? I'm still waiting for my trip to York. My husband's been there, but I haven't. As many of you know, I had to cancel the trip a few years ago. So the Kingstons, you've seen Clifford's Tower, still standing. It's right next to what do they call it? York Minster, right next to her, down the
Across,
street.
it was across
Across
the
the street.
street from the hotel that we were staying at.
I
We
had
had
a reservation at that hotel. I'm going at some point. I don't care. I don't care who misses summer camp. Don't tell my daughter I said that. All right. So here's what happened, just to give you a little bit of history. Um, and it happened in the 1190s, almost at the same 100 years after the First Crusade. So we're actually into Third Crusade territory. So what happened there? The story is recorded by at least the one we're going to read is recorded by a fellow named William of Newburgh, who was an Augustinian from Yorkshire, and he tells the story of two Jews living in York, one called Benedict, which would have been Baruch, and one called, he spells it, and it's written, this was written in Latin, I believe. He spells it Joseus. They weren't speaking modern English yet at that time. And many of them wrote either in French or in Latin was more common. Joseus, but I think it was Yosef or Yossi, which would have been a nickname, and even was in the Talmud days. So Baruch and Yossi, we're going to call them, traveled to London to attend the coronation of Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted, the very much revered king, mostly revered because he spent almost his entire reign outside of England conducting crusades. And that'll help you with your reputation as a king if you're out there being a hero and you leave behind your shitty brother to run the place. And anybody who's ever seen a Robin Hood movie, you know this is the era that we're talking about, right? Prince John, yes, Prince John, who was Putz. In any case, the resentment about the presence of the Jew, there was a great deal of resentment about the presence of the Jews at the coronation. And as you know, they are crowned as they are, were crowned as they are today in Westminster Abbey. The building looked different, but it is the same Abbey. And you know how hard it is to get tickets to that thing. And here's these Jews showing up. We don't really know much about what they did there. But they were what they were really chapped about were the taxes that they were having to pay and the fact that they had to borrow so much money to pay them. These were the Third Crusades now, which led to rioting. And there was a lot of anger towards the government in those days, particularly at Richard I, but then later aimed at his incompetent brother. And these uprisings, these riots, took place in many towns, but among the certainly in London. Well, that would have been at the time Westminster, but in Stamford, in Lincoln, but significantly in Norwich, which we just read about, and in York. Once the king was gone and out on the Crusades, there was a false rumor that went about that the king had ordered a massacre of the Jews. So this guy Baruch was attacked and killed on his way back to York. I shouldn't have said he was on his way to the Crusades. I don't know if that's true. Some months later, however, the sheriff of York also left for the Third Crusade, and then a fire broke out in the city, which of course is going to get blamed on you know who. So between the debts and the taxes that were increasing the debts and the general anger and resentment that was happening, you're going to turn to your scapegoat. And this happens over and over in the history of anti-Semitism. And this was at a time when, as we've seen, this was already happening, that the blood libel. So the Jews in York, they run to what is today called Clifford's Tower. At that time, it was simply the King's Tower. And they ask for refuge by the keeper of the tower inside the castle. Meanwhile, their property is looted, which was really the main purpose of this, to get their dough. And they have absolutely no egress from the tower. And here is then how it is described by William of Newburgh just a few years after it happened. So, and this is part of a long book he wrote called The Chronicles of the Reigns of Stephen Henry II and Richard I. So this is part 3, chapter 9. We get 2 chapters devoted to us here, at least. The attack on Clifford's Tower, where the Jews of York had taken refuge, commences. So while they're trapped in there, the people of the town attack. Certainly, the nobility of the city and the weightier citizens were fearful of risking the king's anger and cautiously turned aside from such great frenzy. Now, I want to mention this is not the account of a Benedict of York, the Benedictine guy of York that we read a moment ago, but neither is the account of Jews. So this is not quite friendly to the Jews, but it's interestingly sympathetic to the Jews, because there was such a thing then too. But every kind of laborer and all the city's young men, with very many country folk and not a few knights, and they would have owed money, came with such speed and pursued this bloodthirsty business as if every single person was pursuing his own business and was seeking the greatest gain. I believe, again, this was probably written in Latin. There were also many clerics, among whom a certain hermit who seemed to be even more zealous than the others. The zeal had set everyone on fire, thinking they were performing a great service to God if they would wipe out a people rebellious against Christ. While with blinded minds they were impervious to those words of David, indeed of the Lord, which are assuredly spoken in the person of the Savior, God lets me see over my enemies, slay them not, lest at any time my people forget. So he's actually quoting from our scriptures, which were his, they appropriated it from us to say that this shouldn't have been done. And there were a lot of people that were against this being done because it was really that bad. And some people had consciences. And some people also had friends among the Jews. This is not, we're not looking here at this isn't, well, even in Nazi Germany, that was the case, right? These aren't societies that are all bad and completely focused on the Jews. Sorry, my ringtone, and completely focused on the Jews. These are peoples who there are people who I don't want to say socialize with the Jews, but have business dealing with the Jews and so forth. Anyway, he goes on to say, our narrator, the Jews living in England in the reign of Henry II had been successful and celebrated in an inverted state of affairs over and above Christians. He's saying they got a little ahead of themselves for a while. And on account of their great good fortune, they had impudently puffed themselves up against Christ. So he's blaming the victim, but he's not sympathetic to the attackers either. Inflicted very many burdens on Christians, and that's the debts we're talking about. For this reason, in the days of the new king, Richard I, their lives, which they had through the mercy of Christ, in other words, our Christianity had protected these Jews, were put in peril by his just decree. Nevertheless, those who inflicted slaughter on them in a riot are by no means excused by the exquisite order of his judgment. The judgment of God on the Jews is always negative, but that doesn't mean the sentence is. When the Jews in the castle realize they can't prevail against the onslaught, this is my summation of the next paragraphs. Some of them decide to offer their lives to God rather than to convert to Christianity or fall into the hands of their attackers to be killed. This is a Gentile source that's attesting to the suicide. So that has for me some credibility. That most notorious man, Yossi, cut the throat of his dearly beloved wife, Anna, with a sharpened knife, nor did he spare his own sons. And when this was also done by the other men, that most wretched old man, a guy named Yom Tov of Wani, I don't speak French, so I always have trouble pronouncing these places, a visiting rabbi from northern France, whom William had previously described as having encouraged the Jews to martyr themselves. And we saw how, whether it happened or not, the messes that we read about in the document from Mainz, it was something that people believed had happened, and it would have probably encouraged people to do it. They slit Yossi's throat because he was more honorable than the others. Soon after they had all been killed together, the interior of the castle began to burn by the fire, which has been said, he said it earlier, had been started by those who were going to die. Supposedly, they set the king's castle on fire. At daybreak, when numerous people assembled to assault the castle, those wretched remaining Jews, even though they were supposedly all dead, but okay, perched on the ramparts, mournfully revealed the nocturnal slaughter of the others, and throwing the corpses of the dead from the wall as visible proof of so great a crime, they proclaimed as follows: God has preserved us from the madness of our brothers, as well as from the destruction of the fire, so that we shall not any longer differ from you in religion in any way. They believed that, according to his account, they believed that Jesus had saved them. And so now all these Jews are going to convert. Indeed, the distress has given us understanding, and we recognize the Christian truth and seek charity. I have no reason to believe that such a declaration was made by them, but this is propaganda. And so, even though he may be describing a real event, he's going to turn it into an event whereby the Jews who saw the light were the ones who should have been spared. Indeed, the distress has given us understanding. We recognize the Christian truth and seek charity. We are ready to be purified by holy baptism, as you are wont to demand of us. And having given up our former rituals, be united to the Church of Christ. Receive brothers out of enemies. Receive brothers, us, now new brothers, out of enemies, and let us live with you in the faith and peace of Christ. Undoubtedly propaganda. But there may have been some who offered to convert. And that's probably the choice that they felt in the tower they were being given, because it's the choice that they had heard about people being given from the things they had heard about, both by word of mouth and by writing, had happened in Central Europe during the First Crusades and later. The leaders, however, of the conspirators were not moved by any mercy for those wretched people. They treacherously plied them with sweet words and faithfully promised them the favor they hoped for, so they would not be afraid of coming out. But as soon as they had emerged, the cruelest butchers hostilely seized them and killed them. All the while they were demanding the baptism of Christ. So he's very critical of the fact that there were people supposedly saying that they would convert, and that the mobs did not accept them. Indeed, of those who were killed by that more than brutal brutality, I would have said without hesitation that if they were sincere in their petition for baptism, they'd have by no means cheated of its effect, baptized as they were in their own blood. He said, in a sense, they actually became Christians. But whether they requested baptism falsely or not, given that speech they made, it sounded genuine to me, but then again, he wrote it. That detestable cruelty of the murderers is unpardonable. The sight of those things in the city was plainly horrific and disgusting, with unburied corpses of so many of the wretched lying everywhere around the castle. Once the killing had been done, the conspirators were immediately made for the cathedral church, and it was all Catholic, the cathedral church, and by violent insistence, forced the terrified wardens to hand over the deeds of the debts. And that's what this was really all about, which had been stored there by the Jews, the king's usurers, the king's lenders, by which Christians were oppressed, and they destroyed the same bonds of unholy greed and solemn flames in the middle of the church, as much for their own release as for the release of many others. These matters occurred in York at the time of our Lord's Passion, on the day before Palm Sunday. So again, it's happening at the Easter Passover time. It was on the Jewish calendar a very special day called Shabbat HaGadol, the Great Sabbath. It's celebrated every year right before Passover, the Shabbat before Passover. So this is an actual event. Afterwards, when they destroyed the records of the debts, which had been kept in the York Minster, it was impossible to know who owed what, but the Jews were gone anyway. And of course, we've already talked about what triggered it. It was the ongoing Crusades. It was the approaching celebrations for Easter and the fact that Passover was nearby. It was the debts, and I will not, cease to talk about that, because it was a very, very major motivation. And this was the trap that many Jews were placed in. They didn't really have a lot of choice in what they could do for a living. And in England, as in other places, it became much more, it became almost impossible to live without, in some ways, exploiting the people around you, because the only thing they had to sell was money. A little bit of a epilogue to this, and then we'll conclude the class. I'm going to turn off the recording at that point. If you guys have any additional questions, I'll hang around for a minute. When Richard I learned of this, and he did learn about it, he said it was an affront to his honor. He held an inquest. The guy who led it apparently had some of his property confiscated. The whole city of York was fined, but no individuals were prosecuted. Nobody was specifically punished. There were documented by enough people for us to believe it 150 who were killed. It took them until 1978, before any statement was issued by any of the royal trust and so forth about what happened in that tower. It just stood there as a place where tourists would go. In 1978, they erected a plaque there commemorating the massacre. Some of what I found was actually on the website of the Royal Trust collection. It's at the foot of the tower, um, where another building had been placed subsequently. And to this day, every March around the anniversary of the massacre, the people of the town, the Jewish community, and others plant daffodils at the base of the tower. The daffodils having 6 petals to remind people of the Star of David, of course, which was not in use probably back then, but is, of course, our symbol today. And we're gonna conclude there, and we're going to learn about subsequently how formal Europeans dealt with this. We've seen how some of the renegade nobles did, and much of the suffering that it caused. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're going to take 2 more minutes because I stopped at the wrong place here. The epilogue continued because it introduces what we're going to talk about next week. In 1218, Richard I's nephew was sitting on the throne, Henry III, and now official anti-Semitism becomes the order of the day. He becomes one of the first Europeans to proclaim what was called the Edict of the Badge. And this was a special marking that the Jews had to wear to identify themselves. But they didn't have to worry about it for very long, because on the 18th of July, in the year of their Lord 1290, Edward I expelled all the Jews from England. For 400 years, there were no Jews in the British Isles. It was Oliver Cromwell who overturned the edict in 1657. But we're not going to spend much time on Cromwell because that's a different story for a different time. What we're going to do next week is begin to look at the systematic and official both persecution and sometimes protection of the Jews in Western and Central Europe, but which became so heavy that it ultimately resulted in several other countries doing exactly what England had done. And fortunately, at least on the upper European circuit, they found a country they were ready to go to, which we're not going to be visiting too much right now, not until way later. And that's Poland. And Poland and Lithuania, the kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania, where they did quite well. So they're not for at least for quite a long time. I know Natan taught a class on that. So that's really a good class to learn about where the Jews did succeed in Europe and where our community grew. This is the place to learn about the horrible and sad things that happen. So we'll talk more about this later. And I seem to be like right on my goal. I'm getting everything done in exactly my thing. So I think 4 or 5 more sessions, and then we're going to take a break for the I always take a break with this class after Passover or at Passover, and then we resume in the fall after the holidays. This is a Rosh Hashanah to Pesach Monday class. All right, thanks for joining me, everybody.